Let me come back at this. You see, what I find intriguing about Peter's answer is mathematics doesn't come tumbling out of absolutely nothing. The concept of the null set is not absolutely nothing. And it takes a creative mind to develop the mathematics out of what he calls absolutely nothing. So the analogy would be that the universe can, by a creative mind, be created out of absolutely nothing. That's point number one. Point number two is the universe reflects mathematical structures, but I think we want to realize that mathematics doesn't cause anything. Newton's laws describe what will happen. They don't cause motion. And it seems to me that's a profound mistake that I see in a number of books, as if mathematics could create the universe. I mean, 2 + 2 = 4, but that never put £4 in my pocket. It doesn't create anything. And I would go back to the fact that I agree with Peter. On the basis of a naturalistic science, it is a vast mystery of how we have this universe. And I would go further than that, and I say that the only answer to it that makes sense to me is... No, just a minute. I'm not finished yet. Yes. We can explore the mechanisms as much as we like, but our explorations and the very way we do them is, as a totality, pointing towards a mind behind them. And that didn't hinder science in the 17th century, and it needn't hinder science.
Hi folks, this is Jay Holyoke here today. I'm just making a video today concerning is Christianity intellectually lazy? And we're going to hear a clip of John Lennox debate Peter Atkins, and I'll link to the debate. Okay.
Works as a description of nature, and you say, I'll just assert that there is a God behind it all, and that seems to me to be a terribly lazy way of approaching an explanation of the world. What I have to do as an atheist, as someone who does not see any evidence for God, is to say, can we get to the root of why mathematics works? And it's a real question, I don't deny that, and it's a wonderful question, and science is not yet able to answer it, but it is working towards it, so millimeter at a time, rather than taking this giant lazy leap to say, we won't understand why there is a mathematical description of the world, it must be a God. That seems to me to be the laziness in the extreme.
Well, I can't speak for everybody, Peter. I mean, there may well be people that say, well, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. But I don't think I'm doing that at all. What I'm saying is the very doing of science, as science increases, is a pointer to me that the rational intelligibility of the universe has a ratio, has a mind behind it. But that's not a science stopper. That doesn't stop me investigating in every way possible.
But you see, it's such a complicated view. I like to take the view that you should start from a simple explanation. It's a Occamist view, William of Ockham, saying that, don't add hypotheses. Try to get away with the simplest possible explanation. So I, as a scientist, I, as an atheist, say, I want to see whether a minimal assumption of maximum simplicity can be deployed to account for everything that can be known and is known. And I will add to that bony skeleton of a hypothesis flesh, only if flesh is shown to be needed. And I think God counts as flesh. And if science can show that there is nothing that cannot be explained by not invoking, without invoking the hypothesis of God, then that there is no need to impose God on the explanation, except through sentiment and all the other things that drive religious belief, like fear of one's own annihilation, worrying about the origins of morality, worrying about how people would behave if they thought there was no God. All that sort of stuff is jam on my toast.
We'll come to the jam later, and it's a very interesting comment. Can we get down to a specific, perhaps, piece of toast? I read you from Anthony Fleur's book. There is a no crossed out a God, and he talks about in 2004 speaking in New York, and actually as a famous atheist turning around and saying, well, actually I've now changed my opinion. They asked him, does recent work on the origin of life point to the activity of a creative intelligence? And he says, yes, I now think it does. It's a major change, almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. What I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. It's the enormous complexity of the number of elements and the enormous subtlety of the ways they work together. The meeting of these two parts at the right time by chance is simply minute. And so he founds his belief in God, although to my knowledge he hasn't yet said which kind or who, on that belief. Is that a rational basis for belief?
Well, he's a philosopher, and philosophers don't really understand the nature of the world. I mean, scientists understand the nature of the world. I've alluded on another occasion to the difference between philosophers and scientists, that scientists are optimists. They think that there is going to be an explanation, and they're driven, not necessarily by belief in God, but they're driven because of their belief in the likelihood that a rational explanation will be observed. Philosophers, I'm afraid, are pessimists, because they are always putting the brake on knowledge by saying that this is not the sort of question to ask. We can't expect an answer to this kind of question. We're human, we're trapped in our human carapace, and we can't break out of it. And so they are the pessimists. And so, of course, worst of all are theologians, because they add obfuscation. And so philosophers have to come along and strip away theological obfuscation, and then scientists come along to give the real answers, the believable answers, the evidentially based answers to questions, and therefore the reliable answers. Now, Fleu's remark there shows a total lack of understanding of the power of evolution and its mechanism, which is largely natural selection. It's an extraordinarily powerful way of permitting, and I use that word advisedly maybe, permitting change to take place by random exploration. Some of those random explorations end up in the organism's death, because we call them disease. But some of them enable it to survive just a little bit better and go on to replicate themselves. And so we have that story of the gradual accumulation of complexity that evolution enables. And even though DNA is the most complex molecule that we know, there's no reason to suppose that it cannot have been developed by simple chemical processes, amplified and welded into the environment and propagated by evolution and natural selection. So complexity, even awesome complexity, can arise by chance, by seeming chance. And the root of evolution is chance, but a happy accident sometimes leads to greater survivability and greater reproducibility. And so complexity gradually grows. There is nothing mysterious about DNA, and to assert that an intelligence must have laid behind it is simply the musings of a senile philosopher, or the meanderings of a lazy mind, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to respond?
I would, I'd love to. I wouldn't be as hard on philosophers and theologians as Peter. Perhaps he's had a bad experience of them, I just don't know. But certainly I don't think that all of them reject evidence-based thinking, certainly not in my experience. And in my contact with Anthony Flew, which was relatively recent, I don't think his thinking is the result of a lazy mind or a senile mind at all. What strikes me about this is...
It is the result of someone not understanding molecular biophysics.
No, I'm not convinced at all by that, for the following reasons, that DNA is not a product of evolution, because evolution assumes that there exists a mutating replicator. But the origin of that mutating replicator is a completely different thing, and I'm sure, Peter, you're aware that Darwin's theory does not cover that at all. We're talking here about the origin of life itself, and it seemed to me that what you were talking about was what happens when life gets going. But the basic insight is, it seems to me, this, that if I pick up, say, a book here, Galileo's Finger, and I look at it, even if I only see the top part, Peter Atkins, I immediately infer, because of the semiotic nature of what's written here, the linguistic nature of the writing, whatever automatic processes may have been involved in the production of this book, I immediately infer, because of the nature of the complexity of just those dozen or so letters, that there is ultimately a mind behind it. And therefore I do not think it unscientific to make that inference.
But this is
when we look at DNA.
This is Paley's watch argument.
But Paley's watch argument is not a bad argument, is it? In itself. It's extraordinarily accurate, it seems to me.
Okay, so we'll talk about this video just for a minute, and then I've got one or two things to say. The debate is a brilliant debate. It's by Peter Atkins, who's written a lot of books on chemistry and other subjects as an atheist, and then who's a professional chemist, and then you have a professor of mathematics in John Lennox, who's a Christian, and they're debating. And it's a really, really excellent debate. Would encourage you to watch the debate. Fascinating, especially if you're interested in science and the nature of philosophy and science and theology. It's a very enlightening debate. I just want to pick up on Peter Atkins' charge that Christianity is intellectually lazy. You saw the comments that he made about philosophy. It was very disparaging, and I've heard him live in debate in Manchester with William Lane Craig, and that's his often tack, is sort of downplaying philosophy. And you see that in a lot of atheist propaganda and critiques of Christianity and religion, in the sense that, you know, we don't need philosophy with theology tagged on to answer any questions. Science can do it all. And I think that is really intellectually lazy, because the true scientific method is willing to deal with the evidence in hand. And there's certain evidences that you need to be intellectually honest about. Number one, if you're intellectually honest, science, however great it may be, rooted in evolution, cannot come up with or explain morality. It just can't. A scientific reductionist view of morality has never worked and never will work, because simply this: we're more than just a concoction of atoms that we can just analyze. There's something more about us as human beings. There is something transcendent about us, and we can't just put human beings into a scientific bottle and say we've sussed human beings out. So in other words, scientific reductionism fails to explain morality. It fails to explain why there are moral absolutes. If you say that it was just social norms, then there's no right and wrong ultimately. So a scientific model of morality just cannot work. And that points us to the importance of religion, especially the Judeo-Christianity, which was, by the way, the foundation of our human rights that we enjoy in the West today. If you don't believe me, an atheist philosopher, Professor Habermas, has said that, has been on record of saying that, and he's a world-class philosopher. That quote is in Dr. Lennox's books, Gunning for God, if you want to check out that quote. So Peter Atkins charged that Christianity is intellectually lazy. He's failing to really deal with the fact that science can't answer the moral questions, ultimately the big moral questions of our time. Secondly, there are big philosophical questions that, if we use science, science can show us that there are these philosophical questions, that there are these transcendent questions beyond the material. You see, scientific materialism, as it looks at the universe and it looks at reality, true scientific materialism will take into account the whole of totality of reality, whereas Peter Atkins is doing, what he's doing is he's only looking at half of reality, and he's using scientific materialism to explain half of reality and saying that that's all that reality is. So for example, all that there is the material in the universe, and that's all that we can analyze and understand. So he's taken half that reality with scientific materialism, and saying that scientific materialism can explain the totality of reality when he's only looking at half of reality. Because true scientific materialism will see, if you're a true scientist, you will see that from a scientific point of view you cannot answer the issue of freedom of the will. If you answer it from a scientific reductionist position, you destroy the freedom of the will. So evidently, science can't answer fully the freedom of the will. It does point to, if we're intellectually open and honest, to something transcendent within the human nature, to something beyond the material, and if we're scientifically honest, we will be open to that, because that's where the facts lie. If we follow a reductionist scientific view of freedom of the will, we have no free will. And if we have no free will, then we're not even human, we're just robots doing a program of some natural phenomena which has caused our actions. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to the experience that we have as human beings. The issue of something coming out of nothing, it doesn't matter how much you're going to gain in knowledge scientifically, science is not going to answer that question. How can something come from nothing is a theological and philosophical question. Also, the facts of nature as well. Peter Atkins and the atheist and evolutionist love to glorify their position that they are scientific, they are the ones with evidence, etc. But it's not true, because there's tons of evidence to point to a God within nature. For example, if you look at DNA, there's so much information in DNA. There's more information in the genome than there is in this encyclopedia. Now we know in that encyclopedia that an intelligent person has edited it, put it together to give us that information, but there's more information, intelligent information, which is more sophisticated than this encyclopedia in the genome, in the gene. Okay? Now that points to intelligence. Whether you agree with it or not, it points to intelligence. You say, but we can explain it how it happens through the process. It doesn't matter if you can explain it through the process or not. The point is, there is complex information within the gene which is more complex than a computer, more sophisticated than our highest sophisticated computers. That is pointing to intelligence. And Antony Flew, the atheist who became a deist kind of thing, he was not senile. He saw the evidence was pointing towards a God. Okay. So it's Christianity is not intellectually lazy. It answers some of the big philosophical questions, the big moral questions, and it also is applicable to the natural evidence. As we look at DNA, another example with evolution is one of the great facts of science is the law of thermodynamics. Everything is running down in the universe. Now, geneticists have been studying the genome, and they've worked out that actually the gene is losing its information. Every time you have a child, every time someone has a child, they lose about 5% of the information within the gene. In other words, the gene is deteriorating, it is dying, it is not evolving. And that is an agreement with the overall physicist position of thermodynamics, is actually happening in the gene itself, which is a direct contradiction of evolution. So the Christian is not intellectually lazy. They want to take evidence, they want to look at the scientific evidence, but also they admit that there are big philosophical questions, and Christianity answers these big philosophical questions. One of the big philosophical questions is there a purpose to life? Now, that is not a scientific question. Science can never prove or disprove that position. That is a theological and philosophical question. So I would say that Peter Atkins, an atheist, are not intellectually honest, and they are intellectually lazy. Basically, they have a deep-seated prejudice towards Christianity. They don't want Christianity in the public arena. So they try to strip Christianity of its intellectual credibility by giving themselves the high ground of that they are science and that Christianity is fairy stories, and that's the propaganda that they pump out. But that's intellectually dishonest, and it's intellectually lazy, because it's not being willing to face the reality of nature, i.e. the gene is complex and full of information which shows an intelligent designer. Okay? I.e. something cannot come from nothing. It doesn't matter how much you know about science, you will never get to the bottom of the question. Something cannot come from nothing. If you're saying that something came from nothing, you are believing in fairy stories yourself as an atheist. And it's interesting that atheists will bang on and say, you know, life obviously came from other chemicals. Well, where did the chemicals come from? And where did whatever that came from? And you still don't answer the problem. Okay? The fact is, you're just not willing to be intellectually honest, and you're intellectually lazy. Just as a side, this high ground that these atheists take about the scientific ones, which is just nonsense, because the history of science, as Dr. John Lennox pointed out, was inspired a lot by Christian scientists. We have Kepler, Galileo, Copernicus, and Newton, Faraday, etc., all influential in the history of science, and we're Christians. So being a Christian and involved in science is no contradiction. And so, if you look at theologians today, there are a number of theologians who have been leading lights in theology and science, such as Dr. Alistair McGrath. I don't agree with everything he says, but he wrote a 3-volume work on epistemology, science, and theology. And this guy, T.F. Torrance, not in this particular book, but he did a lot of work, cutting-edge research and work in science and how it related to Christianity. And there are a lot of top high-flown theologians who have a passion for science and relate it to theology. So it's just not intellectually honest to say that theologians are these anti-intellectuals and science comes along and sorts the theologians out. It's much more complex, much more nuanced, much more sophisticated than they're willing to admit. So, Christianity is not intellectually lazy. I think atheism is at the present time. Thank you.